So next up, our two, Isaac, Fullinwider, and Jieqi are probably two of the smartest and most passionate engineers that I've worked with at Facebook. They're both on the site integrity team fighting spam. They sacrifice many Friday nights, many weekends, and probably a little bit too much of their lives fighting spam. And they're going to talk about the technique of using counter and cluster-based to fight spam and why this is important on a platform like Facebook where it's very diverse and fast-paced. Let's welcome Jieqi and Isaac.
Is this thing going? This thing's going. I don't need the handheld? OK, yeah. No. The best years of my life. So, hey, I'm Isaac. I work in site integrity at Facebook. And I'll be talking about some of the kind of common patterns and techniques that come up when you're doing this type of rule development. So we're going to start from the start. We're going to start with spam. This is an example spam post, or an artist's depiction, representation of spam, if you will. Some account has posted some text. Please come get you some free diet pill sex chat iPhone, and a URL you can go to in order to get that. There's an enticing photo. There might be an enticing photo to convince people to click. And this request came in from some machine somewhere in the world and from somewhere on the internet. And this is, when you're kind of doing an event-based processing thing, this is like the single event that you have to decide, hey, is this good? Is this bad? But it's probably part of a larger spam campaign, and we don't necessarily even know what the root cause of this is. This could be a malware-infected user. It could be a phishing attack. It could be some kind of social engineering thing, or maybe a mass registered fake account, or if we're unlucky, some kind of hybrid combination of that. So the kind of question we're asking here is these streams of events that we have to make decisions on, and how can we have methods that apply across all these different root causes of spam that we can cater to diagnosing them, or even stop the distribution regardless of the root cause. And I think a lot of you kind of know the answer to this, but doing aggregations is very helpful here to tie the single event that you have to make your decision on to the larger spam attack that's happening. So when you're looking at a single event, it can be very difficult to even get enough signal to make a decision as to whether or not it's good or bad in a reliable way, where you'll have an acceptable false positive rate. And then even worse, if you do have maybe you do have a good signal, but now you're in a place where your attackers can iterate very quickly against you because they try different events, and the ones that go through are basically always going to go through until they hit some time. Your mic dies. No. At which point you've lost. Here we go. Double mic'd. Yeah, so looking at aggregations to tie all these different events together helps you make a higher confidence decision. And so instead of looking at a single post, maybe that has a bad URL, you try to pull in features from all posts that you've seen recently that contain that URL. Instead of looking at a single login to decide, hey, is this a phishing attempt or a real user logging in, we look at features from all logins from that IP space. So either that IP address or some NetBlock mask or the ASN, what have you. Instead of looking at a single registration to decide, hey, is this a fake account, we can look at all registrations from some network space, or we can co-locate by the type of platform signature you have. So browser, OS user agent, if it's a phone, what kind of phone, and some tuple of that to help put this event in context. So some definitions some vocabulary to define this space. We want to have an aggregation dimension. It's some focal point that ties all these different events together, all these disparate events. And the examples I've given so far, URL, IP, et cetera, are all pretty common here. Then you have some set of entities that you're looking at over this aggregation dimension. And so this can be the event itself, or it can be some kind of object that represents the event, either the user that's taking the action, or it can actually even be a URL or IP as well. So you have attackers that never repeat URLs per attack, and then you can maybe use your URL as an entity as opposed to and aggregate on something else. Then you want to make a decision to classify something, so you have some property that you're looking at to make your decision here. So it can be something that's suspicious. You might consider actually blocking any event that has this property, or it could be something that's relatively innocuous that would only be bad if you see it in volume. And so we kind of combine all these things into an anomaly that says if there's some suspicious distribution of this property over the aggregation dimension, then all these events are bad, and subsequent events on this aggregation dimension are also going to be bad. So back to our artist rendition of spam, like what can we aggregate on? The examples I gave before are kind of all relevant here. You could aggregate on this URL, or like maybe the landing page of this URL if you crawl it. Aggregate on any part of the IP space. We can also look at similar text and content if they're kind of repeating stuff. So in this talk, Jieqi and I are going to cover kind of two distinct but complementary methods for doing these types of aggregations in our systems. I'll be talking about an implementation that uses counters, and Jieqi will talk about kind of a more like offline clustering approach. So it can be useful to use counters here because a lot of times you need to store this information about these events that are coming in. You have each event coming in, you pull out your aggregation dimension, you bump a counter for like, hey, does this entity have this property, and you need to store it over time. But you probably don't want to store that forever, so using time-limited counters kind of lets that bottom out. So let's to a specific example. Here's one where we're trying to classify URLs. And the context here is we're looking at directed posts. We have some attacker, they control some amount of accounts, and they're sending spam through some directed post context. So this is any type of thing where you have a sender, they intentionally pick a recipient, so maybe like a wall post or like a direct message kind of situation. But the point is just it's not a broadcast. And so in the feature we want to look at here is, has the targeted account, the recipient account, ever contacted the initiating one before? So regardless of whether or not this attacker is using compromised accounts or fake accounts, they're likely, to maximize distribution, going to be contacting people that the account they have control of has never contacted before. So if it's a fake account, they have to build up the contact graph like from scratch. And if it's a compromised account, like that graph is already sparse. So if you're maximizing distribution on your URL, you're probably going to hit some cold opens there. And so what we call this feature a cold open, where you're introducing yourself, you're saying, you're sending a message to someone who's never contacted you before. And in spam, if you're sending a URL, it's probably more likely to be spam, because most of the time when you start one of the conversations with someone, you don't say go click on this, you say like hi, or whatever you might normally say, right? So how do we track this? So we can do this. We can track this just using two counters. Your aggregation dimension is your URL. Your entity is the targeted post event. Your feature is like cold open, and then you just bump two counters. One for how many total times have you seen this URL in some kind of targeted post, and how many times have you seen it in the context of a cold open. And then if the majority of that time it's a cold open, you're in a bit of a suspicious state, and you can kind of propagate that badness either back to like the users that are sending it or to the URL itself, or what have you. The cold open feature is pretty useful here because it exists outside of the attacker's control. Like they have no control over whether or not like the people they're sending spam to have contacted them before. So you could get around this in a couple of ways. You could maybe wait. You'd send the actual more polite hi, wait for someone to come back, and then send spam if you wanted to get around this type of detection. But there's like some latency to that, and it implies it cuts down like your potential impressions, and it implies you have to have control over your account for like the length of time that someone's going to come back. And so more likely, you'll probably just try to use different URLs to get around this. But then we're still in a state where we have cold opens and a bunch of URLs that we've have no reputation on, and so you can cook with that. Another example here, you don't have to necessarily use URLs. Here we're trying to capture fake accounts. You have some attacker, they're mass registering fake accounts, or even you maybe, and we for some reason didn't catch them at registration time, or maybe you have a more sophisticated attacker who only registers accounts, and then someone bought like a batch of accounts, and now they're trying to use them. So they control some amount of accounts, they control some amount of IP space, and you hope they have less of one than the other. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at the unique accounts that we've seen on an IP, checking to see if they've registered recently, and then if the majority of the accounts in the IP have registered recently, you know someone's trying to get down to business, or there's something suspicious going on here. Again, we just have two counters. This time they're unique counters, unique on the type of, instead of the single event, you're looking at the unique account. You have one for the number of like recently registered users you've seen, and then you have one for the total number of users you've seen, and you can assert you have some minimum number of observations and check against like whatever threshold works. To get around this, you might imagine like a patient attacker sits on their accounts for a long time. We call these sleeper accounts. And so you can imagine like a parallel version of this policy that instead of looking, has this account registered recently, is like, has this account come out of dormancy or something. And so this kind of keeps a cap on the number of accounts an attacker control an attacker can control, geared off of the IP space they control. But again, with both examples, 2 counters, you check a threshold. And so I've been like pretty vague about this threshold so far. Like usually you can kind of pick something that's intuitive and then vet it kind of in dark mode and see how it goes. But a lot of the times you might actually want to like change your threshold depending on how many observations you've seen. So you have 10 accounts on an IP. You better be like damn sure, right, if you're going to make a call on like 10 observations. But maybe if you've seen like 100 accounts, you can be a little more lenient if, like, say, like 80 of them exhibit this property. So to that end, statistics comes to the rescue here. And because the properties we're talking about are like Boolean in nature, we can represent their behavior with a binomial distribution. So a binomial distribution, you have a random variable that has 2 possibilities. You have a success, you have a failure. And then this distribution describes the amount of successes you expect to see given some number of observations you have. And then you have some prior probability for how likely a success is. And you can see from this diagram, like as you modify this probability, the shape of expected successes can change. This equation here shows that you can compute the probability for some exact number of successes. Like how likely is it that I saw exactly this many young accounts given my prior probability in that case. For spam fighting, we want to be a little more flexible, so we take the cumulative distribution. Instead of looking at like exactly this many accounts, we say like, what's the likelihood that we've seen at most this many accounts? Because 80 accounts is suspicious, but we also want to say it's anomalous if we've seen 100, right? So back to our cold open observation, recast here. We no longer have like our static threshold. We still have our 2 counters. But instead of checking against the static threshold, we have an expected spam probability, and we're kind of running this test to say, we've seen this many cold opens. How likely is it that we saw at most this many, given the probability that we've picked here? And this probability can intuitively be pretty similar to the ratio that you picked before. It's just now the threshold you're setting against is a likelihood. So you pick like, what's the minimum probability that I'm comfortable with here? And you check the output of your binomial test against that. This slide is actually a little bit backwards because the likelihood you want to use here is not that the spam post is a cold open, but that a cold open post is spam. And this is something you can kind of pick yourself. We pick what we imagine a spam distribution might look like because and block as opposed to picking what the real distribution is and whitelisting because it's easier to kind of wrap your head around that. Oh, wait. Yeah, so the last example I'm going to talk about here, this is another IP-based classification example where you have some attacker, they're sending URLs around, they control some amount of users and some amount of IP space. And we want to know, are these URLs being sent by a large number of users from a small number of IPs? This pattern is pretty useful. You can again do this with 2 counters, but the difference here is the type of feature we're looking at. We're no longer looking at a feature on the entity. We're looking at the distribution of entities relative to the total set. So the feature here is like, have we seen this IP post this URL before? But it's easier to think about like how many unique IPs versus how many unique users have we seen. And this works like not just in the URL context, but let's say you're like trying to detect like suspicious page likes or like suspicious follows to an account. You see like a lot of follows to one account from a bunch of different users, but they only come from a small set of IPs. You know, like someone's kind of getting down to business there. So we've seen about 3 or 4 of these examples, and from this you can tell like the code here is relatively simple. It's relatively simple to kind of conceive and think about them, and then like once you have the infrastructure in place, it's maybe like a few lines to throw this out and try it. And probably a lot of you are doing something similar to this, and you know the effectiveness of this comes from some combination of like how clever, sophisticated the features that you're using are, and then how broad your coverage is and how you choose to apply it. So you can use this in a lot of different ways. You can set these all up on a single context. Maybe you're looking at like just logins or just registrations or just photos, just photo uploads or something. And you have a number of anomalies across a bunch of different aggregation dimensions that you can combine to make decisions on that one context. You can also take like a more vertical view where you look at an aggregation dimension in isolation. So you say, like, for a URL, here's all these different anomalies that I have, or for some IP. And you could do kind of a more holistic classification that way. The other kind of advantage of using counters for this is after you have all these anomalies, you're basically sitting on top of you're also sitting on top of all this raw quantitative data that you can then use as like input features into machine learning. So you, when you like retrain and redeploy, that can work alongside whatever ad hoc stuff you throw together based off of these anomalies. So from there, I'm going to hand it over to the esteemed Jieqi to talk about a clustering-based approach for doing this sort of thing.
This. No, thank you. Isaac has talked about the online counter-based anomaly detection system, and that gives us a way to aggregate information on one dimension and have a more confident decision. Next, I'm going to talk about another way of aggregating information, namely the clustering-based anomaly detection system. Assume we have a stream of fruits as input. And as we talked about before, in the counter-based system, we need to store two types of counters for anomaly, for example, on the color of the fruits. So as an example, on apples, we store two types of counters. One is the number of apples we've seen so far, and the other is the number of green apples we've seen so far. And with the expected probability of seeing a green apple, we can do a binomial test and see if this batch of apple agrees with our expectation or not, and if this group of apple is good or not. However, what if we have more storage? What if instead of storing just two counters, we can store the entire batch of apples? In this case, to do the same anomaly is pretty easy. We could just get a sample of these apples and count how many green apples there are compared to the total number of apples and do the same anomaly. Furthermore, since we have all the apples at hand, we can do anomaly detections on the shapes, sizes of the apple, whatever we want, afterwards as well. Going back to our previous example, let's imagine a group of users all are uploading this amazing photo of a goat with sunglasses. And we have a photo cluster with all the UIDs there, and we know where they come from, which IP addresses they come from, what kind of browser they are from. And imagine we store all this information offline. Then we can get different anomalies from there. Imagine most of us have already had probably a pretty good anti-phishing system and classifying each logging. And most of the time, we are probably 90% sure that this particular logging is compromised, and we're going to challenge the users with that particular logging and ask them to change their passwords or something like that. But sometimes we are maybe 40% sure. At those times, we don't want to cause a lot of false positives and create friction at user login time. At those times, we will probably let the users through. And then later on, all of those users decided to upload a photo, maybe that photo with goat with sunglasses. And then when we look back at that photo clustering time and then see all of those users, vast majority of them have a suspicious recent logging. And then we know at that stage that we are pretty confident that all of those users are compromised. So we can write an anomaly like this. We get a sample of the uploaders from the photo cluster. We count how many of those users have a recent suspicious logging, and then we do a binomial test. Similar to the counter example, we are pretty sure that we can get a better signal than classifying a single logging. Since we have all this information stored offline, we can do a little more here. So for example, we can do a sameness test. Spammers register fake accounts in a week, and then they wait for a long time, maybe sold all of these accounts. And then later on, maybe a month later, they decided to launch a spam attack and ask all those users to upload the same photo. And then at that time, since most of us have already have the registration information stored in our database, then we know when those users are all registered. Then we can do a sameness test here. Basically, we get all the users that are uploading the same photo. We look at their registration week, and we get the majority of the registration week by taking the mode of it. And then later on, we know that maybe 90% of them are registered on the same week. Registering on that particular week doesn't give us a lot of information, but if we see all of those users have this anomaly by uploading the same photo, that's the aggregation dimension. Then we are sure that most of them are fake. In this case, we can catch fake accounts by aggregating on this dimension. On a side note, if we want to do this with counters, we probably need a lot of counters. So imagine for each cluster ID, we need to store a counter for each registration week. Depending on when you started your service, it could be a bad time to do that. So after we have talked about a few examples of detecting anomalies on photo clusters. What about afterwards? Once we detect the anomalies, we would put the response or challenge on the users that we know that are fake or maybe compromised. However, even if we know that 90% of the users exhibits the same anomaly, it is not necessarily correct to say that the particular photo they uploaded are bad. It could be a very normal photo they uploaded as a profile picture of a fake account. So it's not necessarily correct to say any other users uploading this particular photo is going to be fake or compromised. In this case, it is beneficial to store the response that we have for this cluster, as well as the anomaly itself, together with the cluster, so that later on we can do a filtering on the cluster so that we don't take users that doesn't fit the anomaly into the response experience. In this way, we can filter out a lot of false positives. In addition to this, sometimes it's beneficial to do reclassification because a lot of the times the cluster grow over time and attacks mutate over time. So for example, if we did a classification at this, when the cluster is at the size of 100 users, we probably want to redo it when the cluster grows as twice as big. This is also a way to filter out false positives as well as following up with the attacks. In conclusion, so we have different types of, we've talked about a lot of the, one of the examples of the cluster type. It's the users uploading the same photo. However, we can have a lot more aggregation dimensions than just this. We could have a cluster that for the users just sharing IPs and logging. We could have users that posting the same text, which is a text cluster. We could have users performing the same action around the same time, which we call a temporal cluster. All those aggregation dimensions we could have as a cluster, and we could do clustering offline. And a lot of those anomalies could actually be applied to all of these cluster type. And imagine if you write a single anomaly, it could be applied to all of them, which is very beneficial. Now it's a real conclusion. In conclusion, Isaac and I have talked about two ways of aggregating information, counter-based and clustering-based. When and why we choose one over another is depending on what kind of information we already have stored and what kind of system constraints we have. For example, if we don't have a lot of storage, then counter-based anomaly detection is probably the choice because we only can store like 2 counters instead of everything. And it also has an advantage of being online, meaning after n observations, we sort of already know the anomaly and can do remediation right afterwards. However, the clustering-based service gives us much more data, but since it's offline, then we might have some delay. But it has the advantage of we can easily remediate the first n observations. Imagine in a counter-based system that after the n observations that we have an anomaly, there's no way for us to go back and clean up the first n users because we didn't store any information about those users. However, in the clustering-based system, it's really easy to go back and clean up all those users as well. Also, it supports arbitrary grouping, and if we develop a new anomaly now, we could go back to all the existing clusters and apply the anomaly to those clusters as well. And no matter which method we pick, both the counter-based or clustering-based anomaly detection system do classification on a group of users and a group of events, as opposed to a single user or a single event. The advantage of doing that is that it's more robust in a sense that we are more confident in our decisions compared to a single user and single event classification. Furthermore, it's more difficult for the spammers to debug. We are not giving them instant feedback at each action so that they could easily change where they come from or what kind of content they are using. It's more difficult for them to figure out what kind of features we're using. Furthermore, as Isaac said, it's easy that we can combine different anomalies together and compose them so that we are more confident in our decisions. So the key takeaway of this talk is that it is beneficial to aggregate low-confidence features into high-confidence decisions along some of the aggregation dimensions so that we could make our detection better. And that concludes our talk. Thank you.
So, for questions, please come over here to the mic so that you can ask any questions you want. Also, I saw people taking photos of our talks. All the Facebook talks are going to be available after this.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Do you constantly recompute these clusters, or are you storing that cluster and all of its constituents and then reapplying it? Specifically, if you want to look at something that's clustered in multiple ways, like temporally and over an IP address.
So we have different type of clustering mechanisms. So for most of the clustering we do, we store the existing clusters as well as with the online example that coming in, we match to the existing clusters. So if they match, they will be added to the existing clusters right away, and sometimes we do reclassification at that time. If they don't match, then we flow them into a log and do classification later. Actually, the next talk will cover some of the clustering techniques that we use.
Great talk. So one question, you have a lot of clustering method and different grouping method. How would you actually select the best ones? Because a lot of you can have enumerate many different grouping methods, but it takes a lot of computation power. Do you have any automatic ways to actually select which one is the best, which one is actually lower quality? Are these all? Also, the question, are these grouping methods also manually generated based on experience, or they are kind of automatic generated?
So some of the cluster types are like for text clusters and photo clusters and other content type things. Those are all kind of generated offline in an unsupervised way, and it's just comparing different samples. For things like URLs or IPs, you kind of get those clusters out of each event themselves, and so you actually more or less have an implicit. You sort of have an implicit cluster. You're not generating anything offline, but you know that everything with this URL is related, or everything in this IP address is related in some way. To the question about when you would look at you're saying IP versus photo versus URL. In some cases, you definitely have rules that incorporate all of them if you're looking at a specific context. But I think that would depend on the type of attack and what they're doing to sort of avoid detection. Because a lot of times you'll have attackers who try to avoid detection on one dimension, but the advantage of having multiple dimensions is that you can kind of catch them if they leave one.
Yeah, and also it's sometimes beneficial to launch all of these anomalies on different detections at different dimensions at the same time, so that it's more confusing for the spammers. For your last question, all of these are handwritten, handpicked. We don't sort of do automatic rule writing.
Yeah, the rules come from experience.
Yeah.
Nice talk, by the way. For the counter-based anomaly detection, how do you determine the thresholds, and are they dynamically adaptable, or how does it work?
The closest thing to a dynamically adaptable threshold comes when you use kind of binomial distributions, which would the actual threshold that you're judging against is going to be dynamic based on the number of observations you have. When it comes to kind of picking thresholds, I generally don't think you need to be too exact. You can definitely run things offline, look at existing attacks, how those map out to your counters, and then kind of vet things. Generally, you don't need to be exact on where this cutoff is, but you just need to have a reasonable cutoff that spam is over here, ham is over here. And a lot of times, depending on the feature you're using, there's a reasonable break, and it's not just like a continuum that you have to pick.
And are these counters dynamically, can you dynamically push them to your real-time systems? Or?
Yeah, so we have a similar kind of rule engine deployment system that the Pinterest talk described. And you do have to, when you set a new counter, especially if you're looking at a time window, you're looking at a day or a week, you're definitely going to have to let that bake for a while so that you can get good data. But you can kind of push those at any time.
Sorry, one last question. And given that these thresholds may vary by time of day and seasons and stuff, how do you adapt to that? Or is that not? Is it just simplistic?
Time of day or
the day of the week or the month of the year?
Generally, you either
because your traffic patterns vary, right?
Yeah. Generally, you try to take either a long enough time window, looking at an entire week, so that doesn't matter, or maybe a short enough time window that doesn't matter. But I generally, with the types of features that we end up using, we're not necessarily setting hard. This isn't the type of feature you use, or this is a hard limit on the number of posts anyone can make at any given time, so you don't have to be is this person awake or is this not? And that also is a good feature if you think that they should be asleep when actually they're active. But in practice, I don't think we've run into a lot of problems from it's nighttime in the US versus it's daytime. Spam doesn't sleep.
We'll take our last question.
Yeah, this is a general question. How do you actually measure your performance? Because we have I work in spam too, so one of the biggest problem is the spammers keep changing their attacks and they go through your system, and then by the time you detect, it's already there's a time lag. And the main problem is how do you continuously have a good ground truth to evaluate your system?
So there's kind of longer term metrics of how is the team doing overall, and then also kind of how are our individual rules doing, and how do you know when to launch them. One of the techniques I like to use is I like to pick a really simple feature of an attack that doesn't change and only log on that, and then try to do something more complicated with an aggregation and compare what that's catching to what I think the ground truth is based on some minor content feature that they're not going to change. But that's specific to an attack. In general, you can also. Sorry.
Sorry, I didn't mean. I think I was not clear. What I meant was, how are you collecting the ground truth to even evaluate? You need to compute, whatever you're computing, the performance metrics. You're measuring against, so many messages caught and out of so many.
You mean how do you collect the ground truth to pick your thresholds?
Yeah.
So the thing is, you don't necessarily have to know the ground truth there. If you're doing something that's maybe you're trying to track browser malware, and so you're doing some anomaly where you're looking at what's the browser diversity of this content. You don't need to necessarily know the exact market share of each browser and see if it matches that. You can know that if one of them is way off, that's fine. So this is what I was talking about when you picking an expected spam distribution and blocking if it matches that, as opposed to picking what you think the ground truth metric is and then whitelisting.
So
Okay.
we'll actually take a 10-minute break right now, and you guys can go ask as many questions as you want with Isaac and Jieqi. So we'll see you back here at 11:30. Thank you.